Every few years, another photograph captures America's imagination. A band of horses racing across the Nevada desert. Dust boiling behind them. Manes flying, nothing but open country ahead. We don't usually ask where those horses came from. We don't wonder whether they're truly wild. We simply look at them and think, that's the American West. But the horse that has become one of our greatest symbols of freedom has one of the most complicated histories on this continent. It disappeared from North America, returned with Spanish explorers, escaped from ranches, helped transform indigenous cultures, nearly vanished, became protected by Congress, and today sits at the center of one of the West's most emotional debates. The legend is real, but the reality is even more remarkable. Howdy, Chip Schweiger here. Welcome to another edition of Way Out West, where the stories of the American West are told, cowboy wisdom is earned, and the legacy of the American cowboy still rides on. There are few sounds more unmistakably Western than the distant thunder of horses crossing open country. Long before highways crossed the desert and fences divided the range, horses carried explorers, hunters, traders, soldiers, ranchers, and entire cultures across landscapes that seemed to stretch forever. Somewhere along the way, one kind of horse escaped our control and captured our imagination. Today, the Mustang has become more than an animal. It has become a symbol of freedom, of resilience, of the American West itself. But symbols have a way of simplifying history, and the real story is every bit as remarkable as the legend. Just a note before we saddle up, you'll find additional resources for today's episode in the show notes at wayoutwestpod.com/Mustang. Welcome back. If I asked you to picture a Mustang, chances are you'd imagine a small band of horses moving across sagebrush country somewhere in Nevada, Wyoming, Utah, or Montana. A stallion's in front, maybe a few mares, young foals trying to keep up, dust hanging in the morning light. It's almost impossible not to admire them. Even people who have never owned a horse understand something instinctively when they see that image. Freedom, independence, self-reliance. And those aren't just Western values, they're American values. And maybe that's why the Mustang occupies such a unique place in our imagination. After all, we don't build monuments to coyotes, we don't write songs about mule deer, and we certainly don't put jackrabbits on the hood of sports cars. But horses, that's different. We've attached meaning to them for thousands of years. Strength, loyalty, adventure, partnership. And when those horses are running without people, we tend to project our own hopes onto them. The Mustang becomes something almost mythical. A reminder that somewhere beyond the pavement and the power lines, wilderness still exists. But here's a question we rarely ask. Wild? Compared to what? Because the word wild carries more weight than most of us realize. It suggests an animal that's always belonged exactly where it is, untouched by people, living the way nature intended. The reality is considerably more complicated, and that's where our story begins. One of the most surprising facts about the American horse is this: its story begins here. Millions of years ago, the earliest ancestors of modern horses evolved in North America. They spread across ancient land bridges into Asia and eventually through Europe and Africa. Ironically, while horses flourished across much of the world, they disappeared from the continent where they first evolved. Scientists generally agree that the North American horses became extinct around 10 to 12,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. Exactly why remains debated. Changing climate almost certainly played a role. Human hunting may have contributed, and most researchers believe it was likely a combination of several pressures arriving at the same time. Whatever the cause, by the time Europeans reached the Americas, there were no horses here. Imagine North America without horses. No cattle drives, no Pony Express, no mounted buffalo hunters, no cavalry, no stagecoaches, no cowboys. It becomes almost impossible to picture the West we know. Then, beginning with the Spanish exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, horses returned. Not as wild animals, as livestock, transportation as military equipment. The Spanish brought Andalusians, Barbs, and Genets, and other breeds that reflected centuries of horsemanship on the Iberian Peninsula. To them, horses represented wealth and power. They weren't meant to roam free, but horses have always had opinions of their own. Some escaped, others were stolen, and some wandered away during storms. Others were deliberately released when they became too difficult or expensive to keep. Over time, those animals began reproducing across enormous landscapes. And that's where another common misconception enters the picture. People sometimes imagine one dramatic moment when the horse suddenly spread across the West. History is rarely that tidy. Horses moved outward over generations. They were traded between tribes, captured in raids, purchased from settlers, bred intentionally, lost accidentally. Native nations didn't all become horse cultures overnight. Some adopted horses earlier than others. Some never relied on them to the same extent. But for many indigenous peoples, particularly across the Great Plains, the horse transformed nearly every aspect of life. Travel became faster, hunting became more effective, trade expanded, territories changed. Entire ways of living evolved. It's difficult to overstate just how revolutionary the horse became. In many ways, it reshaped the history of the West long before the cowboy ever appeared. Meanwhile, ownerless horses continued multiplying across open country, and people began calling them by a word borrowed from Spanish, misteño, or mistengo. It referred to an animal without an owner, a stray, an animal belonging to the common herd. Over time, English speakers transformed that word into something we still use today, Mustang. Notice what that word doesn't mean. It doesn't mean ancient, it doesn't mean untouched, and it doesn't even necessarily mean wild. It simply meant no one claimed ownership. And that's an important distinction, because the legend of the Mustang often imagines a single bloodline stretching back to the Spanish conquistadors. The truth, like most Western history, runs much deeper than that. By now, you've probably heard someone say it. Mustangs are the direct descendants of the horses brought here by the Spanish conquistadors. And there's truth in that statement, just not the whole truth. Some modern Mustang herds really do preserve a remarkable amount of Spanish colonial ancestry. Herds like the Kiger in Oregon, the Surbat in Arizona, or Utah's Sulphur herd have been studied because they retain many of the physical traits and genetics associated with early Iberian horses. They're living reminders of some of the first horses to return to North America. But they aren't the only story. Think about everything that's happened across the West over the last 500 years. Spanish settlements, Mexican ranches, the fur trade, military forts, the Oregon Trail, the California Gold Rush, Texas cattle drives, open range ranching, the U.S. cavalry. Every one of those chapters involved horses. And horses have never paid much attention to property lines. Ranch horses escaped. Army remounts were turned loose. Draft horses wandered off. Thoroughbreds found their way back into breeding stock. The quarter horse blood became common across many regions. Generation after generation, horses mixed. The result is that today's free-roaming herds aren't frozen in time. They're living records of Western history. Each herd tells a slightly different story depending on where it lives. And that's actually far more interesting than imagining every Mustang as a perfectly preserved Spanish horse. Because the West itself was never static. It was always changing, always adapting, always becoming something new. And in many ways, so were the horses. Which brings us to another question, one that seems simple until you try answering it. Are Mustangs wild or are they feral? Biologically, the answer is fairly straightforward. A feral animal is one descended from domesticated ancestors that now live independently in the wild. So by that definition, modern Mustangs are generally considered feral horses. That's the language most wildlife biologists use. But culturally, the conversation gets a whole lot more complicated. Federal law doesn't call them feral horses. The Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 calls them exactly what most Americans already believe they were: wild, free-roaming horses. Congress went even further. The law describes them as, quote, living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. Notice something there. That isn't biology. It's culture, it's history, it's identity. Horse advocates sometimes argue that calling Mustangs feral diminishes their importance. Others point out that horses evolved in North America long before humans domesticated them and see today's populations as something closer to a returned native species. But most scientists don't go that far. The horses living on today's public lands descend from domesticated animals, not from those prehistoric horses that disappeared thousands of years ago. Those ancient populations are gone. Today's Mustangs followed a very different path. Legally, they're protected because Congress chose to protect them. Scientifically, they're generally classified as feral. Culturally, they're wild in almost every way that matters to the people watching them. And maybe that's the better question. Does an animal have to be biologically wild to become culturally wild? I don't know that it does. After all, the bald eagle isn't powerful because we understand its taxonomy. It's powerful because of what it represents. The Mustang has become much the same. The legend isn't wrong. It's just incomplete. It's easy to romanticize life on the open range. The photographs usually help that. A handful of horses, blue sky, golden light, miles of open country. What the photographs don't show are August or February. A Nevada summer doesn't care whether a horse is wild or domestic. Neither does a Wyoming blizzard. Life on the range is beautiful. It's also unforgiving. Drought can dry up springs that horses have relied on for generations. Harsh winters leave weakened animals unable to find enough forage beneath snow and ice. Foals don't always survive. Older horses break down. Injuries that might be treatable in a pasture become life-threatening 50 miles from the nearest person. Freedom has always carried risk. That's true for people, and it's true for horses too. Now add one more reality. Mustangs reproduce. A healthy mare can produce a foal every year or two. Without enough natural predators to significantly reduce populations across much of the West, herds can grow faster than the land can support. Now that doesn't mean every range is overpopulated. Conditions vary tremendously from one herd management area to another. Rainfall changes, vegetation changes, wildlife changes. But across the West as a whole, land managers face a difficult equation. Only so much forage, only so much water, and more horses every year. And suddenly, the conversation shifts. It's not just about horses anymore, it's about pronghorn, and sage grouse, and mule deer, and cattle, elk, and the riparian habitat. Public lands that belong to all Americans. The problem is real. People simply disagree about the solution. Some argue gatherers are essential to prevent starvation during drought. Others believe gatherers are used too aggressively. Some support fertility-controlled vaccines that reduce reproduction. Others question whether they're practical across vast landscapes. Some people believe livestock grazing should be reduced before horses are removed. Others point out that ranching has long been part of how these public lands are managed. And that's before anyone starts talking about budgets. So the Bureau of Land Management now cares for tens of thousands of horses that have already been removed from the range. Feeding, veterinary care, transportation, and long-term holding cost taxpayers well over $100 million each year. Ironically, one of the largest expenses in the entire program isn't managing horses on the range, it's caring for horses that are no longer there. And none of this makes for an easy headline. There aren't any cartoon villains here, not if we're being honest. Most ranchers don't hate horses, quite the opposite. Most horse advocates generally care about the animals. Wildlife biologists are trying to protect entire ecosystems, and BLM employees work within the laws written by Congress. Everyone sees their part of the picture. Very few people get to see all of it. And maybe that's why this conversation has become so emotional. Because nobody looks at a running band of Mustangs and immediately thinks about carrying capacity, or range utilization, or appropriations bills. We see something older than all of that. We see freedom, and freedom has always been difficult to manage. By the middle of the 20th century, America's wild horses faced a very different threat. They weren't multiplying faster than the range could support, they were disappearing. Advances in transportation meant ranchers no longer depended on horses the way they once had. Trucks replaced wagons, tractors replaced teams, many free-roaming horses were rounded up for pet food, animal feed, and other commercial uses. Some gatherers were conducted humanely, others were anything but. One day in the 1950s, Velma Johnston found herself driving behind a truck loaded with captured wild horses on a Nevada highway. Blood dripped from the trailer onto the pavement. The image haunted her. She later said she couldn't stop thinking about it and decided somebody had to speak for the horses. Now, most people know her as Wild Horse Annie. She wasn't a scientist, she wasn't a politician, she was simply someone who believed those horses deserved better. She began writing letters, organizing supporters, speaking to school children, and urging lawmakers to act. Her campaign eventually grew into a national movement. In 1971, Congress passed the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. The law placed them under federal protection on designated public lands. It was an extraordinary moment. Americans weren't just protecting an animal, they were protecting an idea. But history has a way of presenting new challenges. The law succeeded, perhaps better than anyone imagined. The horses survived, and many herds grew. Over time, the very success of the law created a new question. How do you protect a symbol when protecting it becomes increasingly difficult? Today, the Bureau of Land Management is responsible for balancing healthy horse populations with the health of the land itself, and that means difficult decisions. Gathering horses from some areas, offering them for adoption, using fertility control in selected herds, and caring for tens of thousands of horses that have already been removed from the range. None of those choices satisfy everyone. Perhaps they never will. But there is one part of the story that often gets overlooked. Not every Mustang story ends behind a fence. For thousands of them, it's only just the beginning. Spend enough time around experienced horsemen, and eventually you hear someone say something surprising. There isn't much like a good Mustang. Not because they're easy, quite the opposite. Mustangs ask something of the people who train them. Patience, consistency, feel. You can't bully one into becoming a willing partner. You have to earn it. Across the country, adoption programs have given thousands of these horses new homes. Organizations host competitions like the Extreme Mustang Makeover, where trainers have just a few months to gentle, train, and demonstrate what these horses can become. Prison training programs have paired incarcerated trainers with Mustangs, creating second chances for both horse and human. Some adopted Mustangs have gone on to become dependable ranch horses. Others compete in trail challenges, endurance riding, dressage, and working equitation. Many simply become trusted companions. Now, that doesn't mean every Mustang is right for every owner. Far from it. These horses require knowledgeable handling, appropriate facilities, and a willingness to let trust develop over time. Some adapt quickly, others take months or years. But perhaps that's fitting. The horse that survived on its own isn't likely to hand over all of its confidence at once. And when it finally does, horsemen will tell you it's something special. Maybe that's because a trained Mustang never completely loses the qualities that allowed its ancestors to survive. Awareness, sure-footedness, resilience, and an ability to think for itself. Those aren't flaws. They're exactly what kept generations of horses alive on some of the harshest landscapes in North America. So what do we make of the American Mustang? Is it a wild animal, a feral horse, a symbol, a management challenge? The answer is yes to all of it. The legend isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. The Mustang isn't a frozen relic from days of the conquistadors. It isn't untouched by people, and it isn't separate from the history of the American West. It is that history. A story of extinction and return, of escape and adaptation, of indigenous horse cultures, Spanish colonists, Mexican ranchos, American cowboys, army remounts, open ranges, public lands, and ordinary citizens who decided some things are worth saving. The horse that came to symbolize untouched wilderness is, in many ways, a product of human history. At first, that may sound like a contradiction, but maybe it isn't. Maybe that's exactly what the American West has always been. A place where nature and people have shaped one another for centuries, where history rarely fits into neat categories, where legends grow from real events, even if they smooth away the rough edges. And maybe that's why, when we see a band of Mustangs disappear over a distant ridge, we still stop and watch. Ranchers do, biologists do, photographers do, tourists do. For just a moment, nobody is thinking about grazing permits or genetics or appropriations. They're simply watching horses run. And somewhere deep inside, they recognize something that feels bigger than the horses themselves. Not because the Mustang represents a West that never changed, but because it reminds us that the West never stopped changing. The Mustang doesn't have to be exactly what the legend says it is, because the truth is, its real story, one of extinction and return, escape and survival, people and the land, is every bit as extraordinary. The American Mustang didn't inherit the history of the West. It lived it. Okay, before we ride out today, we've got just one more thing. Yep, that distinctive call from Buster the Bull means it's time again for our cowboy glossary term of the week. And today's term is cayuse. So historically, a cayuse referred to a small, tough horse of the Northwest, particularly those associated with native peoples from the Columbian Plateau. The name comes from the Cayuse tribe of present-day Oregon, who became renowned horse breeders after acquiring horses in the early 1700s. Small and powerful, the Cayuse is an exceptional horse. And like the Mustang itself, it's a reminder that a horse doesn't have to be large or fancy to earn respect. Well, that's all for this episode of Way Out West. Thanks for riding with me here. If you've enjoyed the episode, please follow, rate, and share the show with someone who loves the history, culture, and traditions of the American West. And if you'd like to see more of the work we're doing, you can visit ridewayoutwest.com And while you're there, take a few minutes to explore the Way Out West Journal, where we dive even deeper into the people, places, and history that continue to shape the West today. That's ridewayoutwest.com. Until next time, this is Chip Schweiger, reminding you the West wasn't built in black and white. It's landscape of stories, some celebrated, some forgotten, and most far more complicated than we first imagined. We'll see you down the road.